This is Audiogyan, and I am your host, Kedar Nimkar. Welcome to a deep dive into the minds of luminaries from the Indian creative world. Audiogyan presents Improvisation, a three-part series where I talk to artists to understand spontaneity, motivations to improvise, the process of it, and when does improvisation become part of the main set. Satyajit Ray once said, "There's always room for improvisation." I think this needs a lot more investigation. And referring to Ray's comment on room for improvisation, today we have the honor of to have Dr. Trina Banerjee with us on Audiogyan. We'll talk about improvisation in the context of theatre, plays, playwriting, and performance at large. Trina is a assistant professor in cultural studies at Center of Studies in Social Sciences, Calcutta. Her research interests include gender, performance, political theatre, theories of body, postcolonial theatre, and South Asian history. She's also been a theatre and film actress, as well as a journalist and fiction writer. So welcome, Trina, to Audiogyan, and thanks for giving your time. It's a real honor to have you on the show.
Thanks so much. I was really looking forward to this as well because I haven't done too many podcasts in my life, and it does, the work you do seems so interesting. So I'm really looking forward to this as well. Thank you for asking me.
Great, thanks. So as I started off by Ray's comment of there's always room for improvisation, I wanted to kick off the conversation by just setting the context for what according to you is improvisation, and then we'll see how it unfolds. So how do you see it?
Right. I actually started thinking about it when you sent me the questions, and I was thinking that there are many ways perhaps we can approach this word, in the sense that often theatre people or performance people see, when we say improvisation, we think of a certain thing. But if you think of it kind of broadly in terms of its kind of general meaning, there are many, many different kinds of implications in many spheres of life. Right. So usually, see how we operate, and I'll give you examples in a couple of minutes. How we live our lives actually sort of is at the intersection of various kinds of structures, right? Whether it be structures of language, structures of the law, structures of how, of communication, of different kinds of communication. Even games have structures. So the games that we play also are governed by certain kinds of rules, according to which you play the game. And if you don't, then you're thrown out, or you sort of totally decimate yours. And that's true for even video games and things like that, right? So I do feel, and I will also refer to a couple of scholars here later in a bit, but I do feel that we could look at the way human life progresses and the socialization of human beings in this kind of continuous tension between structure and the breaking of that structure, and the impulse to break that structure, right? So while it's true that if we did not follow the rules of grammar at this particular moment, you would not understand me and I would not understand you, right? We are understanding each other precisely because we are agreeing implicitly to follow certain rules, that this is how I'm going to construct my sentence. And if I decided at this moment that I want to rebel against this structure altogether and speak in a completely different syntax, this conversation would make no sense. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect is that if these structures then become too strict, too stifling, then the human impulse is also to kind of militate against them, to try to break free, to do something to destabilize that structure, because we define, at least in the way that Enlightenment philosophy has understood man, we define our humanity, our sort of role as thinking beings through this capacity to think and act freely, to reason. And so if one is asked to blindly follow a structure, that in some fundamental sense seems to be detrimental to the idea of freedom and reason, right? So blindly following a structure, we often say this in common conversation. We don't need to think very philosophically, just common. Are you a robot? What do we mean when we say that to someone? It's not a nice thing to say to another human being. When we say that, and that might soon change with AI and everything, but when we say that now, it's usually some kind of a put down, right? That you're. I mean, if I call you a robot, that means I am a sort of discounting your capacity to think and act freely, that you're entirely programmed by certain structures that govern you. You're unable to act in a sort of agentive way, autonomously, right? And the sense of autonomy is somehow historically in all our minds, associated with the idea of reason. The capacity to think freely means the capacity to act freely. So that's the paradox. So while we need these structures in order for our lives to make sense, on the other hand, our impulse towards freedom always sort of rebels against these structures when they become too constricting, right? So I think a tension between these two impulses defines, various kinds of historical transformations, how society functions at certain points. If you look at, let's say human history, if you just look back at the 20th century, there will be, just commonsensical, if you think of certain decades, you will have an overarching of impression of a particular decade in a particular part of the world as being either transformative or conservative, right? Broadly. There are often obviously contradictory impulses within them as well. So often if you think of 1950s America, you would think of that time being a time of reconstruction, because post Second World War, it was important to rebuild society, which is why certain values of, stability, conventional family, gender roles became very, very important. So in a sense, one was reconstructing after a period of devastation. And it seemed to be safer to follow certain kinds of societal norms, which were conventional and safe, right? But if you see a decade later, beginning with the early 60s, going towards in the late 60s, you see then a contradictory impulse, the impulse for rebellion. The next generation no longer accepts these strictures as necessary. They see what their parents had seen as stability as in fact stifling. And then you come to the generation of Woodstock. The late 60s are turbulent all across the world, creative. So you have
the hippie movement
the hippie movement. You have 1968 France. In India, you have a huge amount of political turmoil. You have the Vietnam War. You have huge sort of protests in America against war within the country. In 68 in France, the students take over the streets, and the universities, they align with the workers. There's so much upheaval, and this happens within a period of 10 to 15 years, because this tension between what is seen as stability and what tends to be the militating force against stability, which is seen as constraint. Right.
Got it. Sorry, if I may interrupt, like if we want to go like one level deeper also to understand that why do we need to break structures? I mean, is it just for freedom, or is it, I mean, there could be two ways to look at it, right? I mean, just to be more creative, you can't really live in a confined way. And because I remember having a conversation with Varun Grover long time back, and I asked him that where does creativity come from, and he beautifully explained sometimes it's because you are given freedom, and sometimes it's because you are sort of confined, and there's always this pull and push happening for you to express yourself. So like, where do you think it does it sort of is seen more when it's confined, or is it seen when it's like more liberal?
There's no one rule. I mean, you would find. So, for example, I'll give you a couple of examples. This period that I spoke about in the USFA, one woman's life actually defines, who we all know. But if you actually begin to look at her writing and her crisis, you will see that it's very easy to actually see what was happening to her as also symptomatic of what was happening to America. So if you look at Sylvia Plath's poetry, for example, through the 1950s, and she dies in the early 60s, I think 1963 she dies, 1961 she dies. She is trying very hard to be everything at the same time: a mother, a good wife to her, poet, genius husband, Ted Hughes. She's trying to do everything possible in order to actually fit into the norm of what is considered to be a successful woman who is also a good housewife, a good homemaker, a good mother, etc., etc. And she constantly finds herself struggling to meet all of these expectations, and she's lonely. She gets lonelier and lonelier, and she's all of this, in fact, her brilliant intellect, her loneliness, all of this shows up in her poetry, and she's almost kind of struggling against this constraint which she cannot any longer name, right? And as many people know, she dies by suicide, right? And it's a tragic event, and then kind of makes her a sort of a sort of a legend. Even now people look back at her. The bell jar, which was really a record of her sort of emotional breakdown. But soon enough, within 2 or 3 years, Betty Friedan writes The Feminine Mystique, where she actually identifies the strange ailment that kind of is ailing all women, all middle class women in America, this depression, which all of them see as something wrong with themselves. And she identifies that it is really about the familial structure in America, which has become so constraining for women that they don't have space to speak their minds. And this actually, in a sense, kickstarts the feminist movement in America. And there's consciousness raising, then there are women's groups that come together, they raise various kinds of social issues and social questions. But the thing is that, oddly enough, the language for identifying what the problem was in a collective, in a transformative sense, was not available to Sylvia Plath, even though she was a real genius with poetry. The moment had to arrive where this is recognized as a collective problem for women. That's just one example. The other example is, so this is one, and the kind of opposite example is that if you look at Iranian cinema, for example, which many of us love a lot, Panahi, the works of Kiarostami, we keep reading everybody, her Makmal Baf, all of these people. So when you look at, and all the films that we will remember, I mean, there are exceptions, of course. There is a long lineage and a long history, but the classics of Iranian cinema, which define it for us, for our generation, are all made after 1980. 1980 is when, the Iranian Revolution happens just before that, and these very strict censorship laws are placed on the cinema. And so historians of film and social historians, in Iran, so Hamid Nafisi and other people, they argue that in fact it was the censorship laws that pushed many of these directors to find a new language through which they could tell their stories, and hence this brilliant creativity, hence this kind of remarkable use of the camera, which is very different from the language of the Hollywood camera, for example. So even Laura Mulvey writes about this, that Kiarostami's camera is unique in that, say, for example, in Through the Olive Trees, he holds back. The climax is really shot from a mile away. So you don't actually know what happens to, those of you who've seen the film, happens to the central couple, whether they actually fall in love, whether they walk away. You don't know because the camera does not let you see. This is something which a Hollywood camera would never have done. It doesn't know how to hold back. So this non-intrusiveness, even while telling the story, is something very unique to the language of Iranian cinema. And many scholars have argued that it was, in fact, a product of censorship. Rather than, so not to validate the censorship, but to say that art finds ways, and censorship at times might have strange effects which were not imagined by those who imposed it. Right? That's what I'm trying to say, because you asked that question. Yeah.
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 So I mean, then is it really seen in, like, because in the earlier thread which you were saying about the movement in America, so is it always sort of working in creative endeavors, or it could be sort of in other?
Oh, yes, sure. I was going to go towards that. So, for example, I said language law, I said, other means of communication. So, for example, I'm going to get slightly theoretical here, but you'll see the reason why I'm doing that. So, one of the defining figures of linguistic theory in the 20th century was this man called Ferdinand de Saussure. Who writes a book called The Course in General Linguistics in the year 1917, I think. So one of the major things that Saussure's major contribution was that he was taking over from earlier scholars who were primarily philologists or historians of language, who were looking at the historical development of languages, the language families. You must have heard the Indo-European family of languages. So you're actually drawing family trees of languages and, seeing how maybe, say, Sanskrit and Latin were related, far back, things like that. Saussure, in fact, was the first person who came and wanted to study, instead of this historical trajectory of language, the structures of language at a particular moment. So it was like looking at this kind of flowing river, when you're looking at this kind of changing transformation of language from one to the other, changes within the language, so a kind of flowing historical trajectory. And Saussure would kind of want to kind of stop that at a particular moment, take a cross section, look at that cross section, and look at the structure. Right. So, in this sense, structuralism is born in the 20th century with Saussure, and then later in anthropology and social and cultural anthropology with Levi-Strauss. Right. He applies many of these structuralist theories to other sort of aspects of society, but not to get too technical there. So one of the major things that Saussure does is that he makes a distinction between the structure of language, which makes possible meaning, and the individual use of language. Right. So, like I was saying at the beginning of this conversation, because we both studied a certain amount of grammar, which has certain common rules and laws, we are making sense to each other. But it is simultaneously true that the way that you use this language, English, let's say, because we're conversing in it, and the way I use it are significantly different. They have to be. Right. So there's the structure within which a common minimum laws and norms we follow, which is why we are able to understand each other. But on the other hand, there are infinite variety of differences in the way individuals use this language. They don't use the same expressions. They will use different adjectives in the same situation. They will express themselves emotionally differently. So to make it very simple, Saussure said that language is actually not operated by similarities, but by differences. So in the sense that you and I, let's take the letter T. You and I write T completely differently, right? But both of those, say for example, I might cross it and you might not. You just kind of draw this thing with a slight, line in the middle.
Yeah.
Very different T's, but both of them are identified by the reader as T. So Saussure says that T remains a T as long as it does not become an F. Right. So any variety of T's would be acceptable as long as it does not change into an other sign. Right. So many different variations are possible within how a T is written. Right. So,
is it fair to say that these variations are improvisations or no?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Perhaps.
Okay.
I'm making, Sasu doesn't say it, but I'm trying to make that connection, right? So what he's saying is that this broad structure is called lang, And these individual things that we do, these utterances, are called parole, everyday language, right? And then he asks, what is the relationship between lung and parole? And he says lung makes these utterances possible. The structure makes possible the individual utterances. But if the individual utterances did not change, then language would be frozen in time. It's because we improvise that language changes over time. The structure is not written in stone. Historically, the structure will change because individuals make a difference over time.
But isn't it ironic, because structure implicitly means there's a structure, there's a grammar which shouldn't change, right?
True, but grammars change, don't they? We have words now that we are having to learn from people who are 10, 20 years younger than us, which were not used. When they speak amongst themselves, my students, even I don't understand sometimes, even though that's English, because they're using a lingo which I am not familiar with. And if I were to start using the lingo that I used in college, they would not understand me. So something has definitely changed. How is this possible? Right. Because individuals over time begin to use words differently. So I think, say, for example, I used the word genius twice in this conversation. So if you look at the root of the word genius initially, even as it is used in Shakespeare, it simply means spirit. It could mean a fairy or a spirit that governs, a person's energy, their life trajectory, etc., etc. Over time, it actually became what we understand it today, which is a man of or a woman of great talent, right? A person of great talent. So this meaning has changed. How did it change? Did somebody kind of make a law to say from this day onwards, genius will not mean spirit, but will mean a person of talent? No. It changed through the changes in usage. Now, how this happens is a matter for linguistics to kind of unearth, and different contexts have different kinds of things, but it happens through improvisation.
Correct. Beautiful. Because sorry to interrupt, but I remember my conversation with Ganesh Devi, and he beautifully put it that it's also, I mean, one of the reasons is that because they want to belong somewhere. Like there is a so the slang came out of just having privacy. Like they don't want to openly say the same words in front of parents or people or like outside the community, and that's how that slang came into existence. So one of the reasons is privacy or sense of belonging of a community, so that they improvise on existing words and then collectively decide that this means this. And if it then if then it just transpires into other groups, then it can come into the larger collective. But
so it's like camouflage. That's absolutely right. It's like a camouflage. It's a code in a sense, but the code is not like a kind of a software code, in the sense it's not kind of decided and written down, and there are no it's no one writes down a rule book for this, but it's improvised, right? It kind of takes on a certain kind of, and then it's kind of distributed, it proliferates, etc., etc. So it's much more flexible and spontaneous rather than kind of somebody kind of codifying, what each word would mean. Yes. So
and so you were saying about the sort of reasons of changing can be inquired in the linguistic study, but how does it change, like what happens when they improvise? Like what are the outcomes of understanding this, or are there like systematic ways to understand that things in different disciplines are improvised and because of XYZ reasons?
Right. So, for example, I mean, improvisations, like I said, could happen for a huge variety of reasons, right? Because someone feels constrained. One needs to find a new way of communicating in a particular situation if you're talking about language. I was also thinking of the law, for example, right? So, when you have a sort of a legal code, as every nation state does, that legal code is not, once again, uh, the code forevermore. laws change. There are amendments to laws, and the many times this. So you can hardly think of anything more stable than a penal code, or maybe it seems like something that is almost kind of eternal.
Hmm.
Oddly enough, that's the impression we have. But the thing is, every constitution would have, every law sort of legal system will have the space for amendment and change, right? um, and what initiates these changes, that's interesting. That does not actually come from within the legal system. The changes come because of a certain push, a certain crisis that is generated in society, a demand from a collective of people, from social movements, that the law must, in fact, now change because the conditions have become different. So, for example, the domestic violence laws, let's say, right, or up to a certain point, let's say divorce laws, all of these, or even sort of the caste atrocity laws, right? The way these were formulated also depended largely because of a certain kind of social condition that recognized something to be a problem which was not recognized before.
Correct.
Right. You have to have the condition of possibility in society for this particular social crisis to be recognized discursively and legally as a problem. And that push actually, and of course always there are conservative sections of society will stand against that kind of progressive change. So that collective push must actually be generated from society itself, right? So in a sense,
Is it a reaction? Is it a reaction? Improvisation is always a reaction?
No, that's not what I was saying. I was trying to say it's not a reaction to the law per se. It is a reaction. It is generated, or it is kind of, spawned by particular conditions and crises of society. Something must happen for that improvisation to take place, right? When you're talking about social and historical contexts. When we talk about individual contexts, the question might be answered differently. But when you talk about, social transformations, historical transformations, there have to be certain contexts which make possible that improvisation. Right. So, but to go back to the question you're asking, improvisation is always risky. Right. Especially in these contexts that I'm talking about, whether it be law, it be language, it be the question of social norm. A deviation is always punishable, right? So an improvisation carries a risk. So, example, even if you kind of go back to the context of a play, if an actor improvises without the permission of the director on stage, he's liable to be pulled up for it right after the show. It will not be taken very lightly. Unless the actor is a great star. It depends also then on the power equation of what is going on backstage. But the thing is, when are improvisations okay? When do they actually engender praise for creativity? At what times do they actually lead to, censure and punishment? Those things also need to be understood. So, and there I think it's very important to make. Yes, sorry. Kedar.
Yeah. No. So yeah. Just because we'll venture into that, just maybe take a one step back, and can you also give some context of what does, because when we spoke on the phone, you spoke about performing arts or improvisation happening on the streets and different forms of arts, right? So what does even improvise mean in the context of performing arts? Maybe we can start there and then go deeper into
Yeah. So, no, just to say one small thing, just to finish my thought, and then I'll come to this immediately, which is that I think when one needs to make a distinction between what we understand as a norm and what we understand as law, in the sense that a norm is something that you can somewhat deviate from without a sort of garnering much attracting punishment to yourself, Right. So if it's a norm to wear saris to school, that which as it was in, say, my grandmother's generation, you could slowly deviate from it one day, wear a salwar kameez and get away with it, right? And it would not actually, it might sort of raise eyebrows. People might talk about it, etc., but it won't actually sort of, So, but the extent of the deviation from the norm defines what the reaction from society will be. How far can you go without attracting punishment? With the law, things are much clearer. You're either on the right side of it or you're on the wrong side of it, right? So that's kind of a yes or no situation. So we need to also understand what is being improvised against, or in, whether it's certain kind of a norm where there's much, it's less, perhaps less risky with the law, So anyway,
Yeah.
with
No,
performance, yeah,
huh.
sorry. Huh.
No, I mean, yeah, that's
Hmm.
a perfect like point where we could
Hmm. Hmm.
start off this, that in law it's kind of black and white, and in certain realms of society and life there is some play
Some
and
room,
happening.
yeah.
But yeah, but in terms of creativity, or in terms
Hmm.
of
Hmm.
these, yeah, creative sort of ventures, it's quite
Hmm.
celebrated. So maybe that's where we can start off, that like what does
Yeah,
it mean also in context
yeah.
of art.
So this is where, when we spoke before, I said that I might in fact question the question a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
because when we speak of improvisation, largely, it seems that, again, once again, that structure, that there's something that is kind of stable and kind of a structure that is more or less kind of mapped out, and someone who is, or actors who are doing something different from it, moving away from it to a certain degree. Now, this assumes more than anything else, what is the structure? In the case of theatre, it largely tends to be the text of the play. Now, the truth of the matter is that in the 20th century, one of the first things towards the middle of the 20th century, or even before that, that was destabilized was, the centrality of the text in the performance. Right? So, one of the major upheavals against traditional theatre was in questioning the text as the origin and as the central defining feature of performance, right? So, how does this happen? So let me just quickly say that, so in the 1950s, in different places, whether it be in America, in parts of Europe, uh, oddly enough, in places like Japan as well, there was a certain kind of a resistance to the traditional structure of theatre, which is the proscenium, which binds, theatrical performances within a particular space, where in fact there is a certain kind of um, theater that bases itself unfailingly on the text of that the text may in fact be radical, it might be very experimental, but there is always a text, right? This was in fact put to question in the 50s and 60s. And this movement that then emerges is broadly, and there are many different kinds of names for it, but broadly now it is called performance art, right? And in the 50s, a person called Alan Capro started something in America which he called happenings. Happenings. And the happenings were literally this. The fact that one would, and this was oddly enough not simply a movement by performers and theater artists, but a place where visual artists, designers, performance artists, those who painted, sculptors, musicians, they all came together. And there was not simply a transgression of the traditional boundaries of the theater, but there was also a certain kind of multidisciplinary experimentation. So in these happenings, what was being said is that this is an event, and this is a singular event. It is going to happen only once, like events in life. It will never be repeated again. It is not preceded by a text which we are interpreting. All our efforts are not going towards the best possible interpretation of that text, which is our origin. The whole of the happening was something that was literally happening in the here and now. Right? It was entirely spontaneous from beginning to end. And the emphasis shifted from the product to the process. So in fact, painters would actually become part of the happening where the process of painting became a certain kind of performance. Right. Where audiences would come in not knowing what was going to happen to them. And spatially as well, there was a huge amount of churning because one did not want to have that constraint of the proscenium stage where the audience was separated from the performers by a particular distance, by the box stage, by this kind of little window through which you looked into another world. Many of these happenings also happened in gallery spaces, right, where gallery spaces became performance spaces, where audiences and performers were in fact occupying the same rooms, intimately connecting with each other. The gallery also was not being used as a gallery, but as a place of performance. So there was a simultaneous rebellion against the gallery space by artists because of the way the gallery constrained art, and also against the proscenium by performers. In an odd way, it was in fact a kind of rebellion against the elitism of these spaces. The fact that neither performance nor art were accessible in flexible ways to broader audiences. Right, so performance art over time actually moved out into different kinds of spaces, street spaces, etc., etc. But what was emphasized more than anything else in the case of performance, people who were coming to it from performance, was that we don't need a text to precede the performance. We will do it in the here and now. Everything that happens singularly at this moment, and it will never be repeated again.
But there's no framework, as in there's no broad outline as well? I mean, a theme or something?
Themes were there, obviously, but a concern could be there. So a concern. So, for example, one of the most famous performance artists of the 70s was a woman called Marina Abramović, who belonged to East Europe. She was actually from Serbia. I mean, former Yugoslavia. So she started working in Belgrade as a solo performance artist, and one of her abiding concerns was with physical pain and endurance. Right. So many of the performances that she would do were actually performances where she placed herself in front of her audience and inflicted pain upon herself. Right. Or there were very famous pieces that she did where, so there was one where she carved with a blade a 5-pointed star on her stomach, right? And and that star was then the symbol of the oppression that Yugoslavia was facing and Tito's oppression and all of that. It became a political comment. Her physical pain then became a political comment on the repressive structures of the society that she was sort of living in. And many of these performances were actually about endurance, about how much her body could withstand. And in this sense, she was throwing an ethical challenge towards the audiences often, because these were audiences who were used to the theater. But the theater happened on stage and they were far removed from it and they were expected to be passive. But she would often put her audience in a situation where they felt the dilemma of whether to intervene in the performance and stop it or not.
Wow.
So this ethical dilemma was something that allowed her to put spectatorship itself into question. So the fact that you don't belong to the performance, if the Desdemona is dying, it doesn't concern you. You can revel in the pity and terror without worrying about the actress because it's all as if Shakespeare wrote it, so it's being simulated. That simulation is taken away. So as if is being replaced by it is, there's no character that is being embodied. This is my body. Here I am in front of you. I'm present, and this is happening to me. That becomes performance art, which changes the entire relationship, even the ethical relationship with the spectator. So it becomes very, very different kind of. So Marina Abramovich does a numerous amounts of work, different works in the 70s, and then she becomes a huge star, and then she moves to America later, and then in 2005 or 2010 there was a retrospective of her work at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and a group of younger artists and dancers were auditioned and hired to recreate many of these classic pieces which nobody had seen. They had only seen photographs. But then the question was raised that, well, if this was performance art, how can you in fact recreate it? It was meant to be a happening that was one time only. The intensity and the singularity of that moment was never to be repeated. That's why it was so valuable. How is it that you're now recreating a retrospective of these classics? So that in itself was put to question. So in terms of so then this whole thing would destabilize the question of improvisation. When we speak about improvisation in theatre, we assume that there is a text against which a certain kind of improvisation might happen. This whole movement had made improvisation the center of its quest. Right. So every event was in fact an improvisation where no one, including the artist, knew what was going to happen.
This is so fascinating. In Indian context, at least, we also have a common word, right? Prayog.
Yeah.
It's a practice, it's a performance. So is this because of the same connotation of you are recreating almost as the happening, but yes, there's a slightly tighter structure as opposed to which Marina sort of like very open.
So I think, as far as I understand, in the Indian context, prayog would either mean application or experimentation. Either
Hmm.
of those, right? Something like that. A prayog.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, at least in the Marathi theater, we say that as prayog ahe, which is like today I have a performance, but
Uh,
it it has that connotation that it's going to be recreated and it will be
yes.
different than the earlier performance.
Yeah.
That's why they are
Yes.
kind of experimenting, and it
Yeah.
wouldn't be as real as or as replica of a cinema, which can't be changed one shot. But here it's going to be little improvised.
Right. So now I have to come to that. So having said all of this, it might seem like I am implying that every show of, a theatrical text, every performance of a theatrical text is in fact non-improvisation. I'm not saying that at all, because one other thing that happens in the 20th century hugely is the idea of the stability of the text is itself done away with. I mean, it's put to question seriously. So often so this was actually a question in our postgraduate exam when I was still studying literature. So in the MA exam, so one of our, in the literary theory course, so we were asked, if the Mona Lisa is in the Louvre, where is Hamlet?
Hmm.
Ah,
Interesting. Hmm.
where is the text of Hamlet? Right? Is it in the. So, first of all, there's a whole lot of debate about the various folio and quarto editions of Shakespeare, like which was. So, Shakespeare, obviously, it was performed first, then published, right?
Hmm.
So, which
Hmm.
versions were being first published? Which was the authoritative version? Which would you go to as the sort of the single most important and authentic text, etc.? All those questions were there. Then, secondly, was Hamlet in that printed text? Or was it in Olivia's performance? Is it in Haider? Is it in. Where is it? Right? So every time Hamlet is being performed, um, it is being recreated.
Recreated. Yes. Hmm.
Yeah. And not just that, every performance of the same production is a new recreation.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's not as if Laurence Olivier performs Hamlet on such and such date, his performance over 600 shows is the same as the one on the first date. Each performance, and this also becomes a theoretical um, sort of intervention in the 1980s and 90s from performance studies scholar that each performance is a unique event, right? Which in fact even cannot be recorded. So if you record a performance, it is not the performance. Your presence and the proximity of two people in a, or more than at least two people, a performer and a spectator, is necessary for the performance to be actually understood and experienced, because the embodiment and the presence of people in a live event defines these live arts. When you record it, it's a kind of a mnemonic device of the performance. It's not the performance itself, right? So something is lost in this translation between the live event and the record, right? And that is precisely because, and this is a related point, each event is unique. And if you ask actors, they will tell you that no two shows are the same, no matter how much they follow the script and the directions.
Correct, correct.
So there are yes.
And so because in the early sort of 1900s, these kind of rebel or questioning or performance ways of performing were challenged and questioned and then improvised upon. Will it be like where will these theater of the absurd or pantomime or these different kinds of genres of theater, are they responses to improvise, or they are structurally totally different and just like came out of, I don't know.
So, for example, the theater of the absurd that you're talking about was also a kind of response to the devastation of the World War, right? In the sense that if the two major genres in the Western context of theater were seen to have been comedy and tragedy with its defining features, post World War, because of the extent of the devastation that was noticed, that was experienced, across Europe and the world over as well, it seemed that those genres do not actually capture the emotional landscape of what had happened to humanity. The extent of that violence and devastation was in fact absurd, meaningless, sort of kind of almost bringing this nihilistic perspective to life of a meaningless world that wasn't going anywhere. Even in tragedy, there's redemption. There's a certain kind of, transformative potential in tragedy. In the absurd, in fact, there is nothing. There's pure meaninglessness.
So it's a response to a social setup,
historical content.
As opposed to challenging the text itself.
The textual challenge comes, but it comes as a corollary of this primary impulse, right? So when says a sort of, who are you going to talk about? Beckett, Pinter, all of these people, when they're writing, the text obviously changes, but that's not the impulse. The impulse comes from this kind of how to understand what kind of text can I write to capture the utter banality, hopelessness, meaninglessness of the world as I experience it today. So waiting for Godot is not waiting for God, because God has disappeared from this landscape, right? It's a meaningless kind of sort of godless landscape of absolute devastation, and the same things keep repeating without going anywhere. So it's a picture of, I often feel that it's a picture of hell where there are no devils, but it's basically time that is kind of endlessly looping on itself, right? Waiting for Godot, text like that. Right. So that's the sense it creates, this absolute hopelessness and devastation. Right. So that the textual improvisation actually follows this need to actually find a new language. Like I said, in the case of Iranian cinema, the new language is the improvisation has to have an impulse that comes from somewhere, which is deeper. Yeah, if you have a question, or otherwise I had another point which I will tell you.
I'm trying to sort of tie the and because of my nature of trying to
mm,
find structure,
mm,
I'm just like
mm,
loosely. No, actually, I'm trying to articulate. It seems like it's always improvisation has in the performing arts space
mm.
is somewhat a response or a reaction, uh, is what I'm comprehending.
If you put it like that, then everything we do in life is a response of a certain kind. Every poem
No,
is a
but this reaction is looking at something outside you, as opposed to when I was having a chat with on music in the same
mm,
topic. It's typically your own expression and your own discovery. So something within and something outside. I'm trying to just connect the dots, and I don't know whether I'm.
no,
Uh,
you're making sense, but I just want to kind of problematize this outside inside distinction because I do believe that when we speak of impulses from the inside, those impulses are also conditioned by the world in which we belong, the
mm,
lives we live, right? So the reason why Tagore has a certain kind of impulse, standing on Sada Street to write a poem about the dawn in Calcutta, also uh, is defined by who he is, which family he is born into, what training he has had a child. Right? You cannot separate the two. There is nothing that comes ex nihilo. The way so the most spontaneous of our, what we consider the most spontaneous of our impulses, love, for example, or you know, melancholy. All of this, the way even we articulate to ourselves these impulses, are also defined by our social conditioning, which is why each of us is so unique. Otherwise,
correct.
we use different languages, we tell ourselves different stories about our own lives. In fact, even what we say about our own lives to ourselves even will change over time because our circumstances have changed. Right. So therefore, there is no kind of
It's,
untouched,
hmm.
yeah, untouched truth inside ourselves, which is not touched by the outside. That's what I'm trying to say.
Correct, correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, it need not be binary. It's not like it can't
Mm.
be fragmented. It's
Yeah.
it's it's a continuum, I think. Like it,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah.
Each influences the other. Not to say that the inside does not influence the
Mm,
outside as well. That also happens, which is why things change in the world. No, but I just wanted to give you one other example. So one of the ways in which this happens in, in 20th century theater, one of the major sort of interventions in this is in the theater of Auguste Boal, who actually coins the theater of the oppressed, right? It comes from, South America. Theater of the oppressed actually talks about a theater which does not imagine itself as a totality. So there is a text of a certain kind, right? But Boal does not imagine this text as a totality. He says that the structure of this text, the ending of this text, the process with which the text will develop, will also depend on the spectators. And
mm,
he coins this term called the spect actors. So the play is performed and a certain situation is created in the performance space. And this is a mode of social intervention as well, this theater. So a certain social problem is presented in front of an audience. And then the audience is asked, how would you end this? Or two possible conclusions are given and say which conclusion do you think is right and why? And then the
mm,
spectators decide either they come and intervene, they perform it themselves, the ending they prefer, uh, or they suggest a particular way that the play ends. So the text does not remain a closed circuit. It opens itself out to the possibility of improvisation, not just from the actor, but the spectator themselves. And in this way, a certain kind of social change is imagined. Right, so the theatre of the oppressed is theatre that has actually truly democratized itself in taking away authorship from merely the author and giving it to the collective.
wow. Hmm.
Right, so that's one mode of what you would call improvisation.
Hmm.
It's
Beautiful.
quite, yeah.
And again, just double clicking on this part.
Mm,
Um, is this because so I'm designing for last 20 years, and the more you deep dive into your particular domain or subject,
Hmm.
you're trying to find deeper meanings and deeper layers of understanding, and thereby trying to find some sort of abstraction to it so that you can keep it more democratic or keep it more open to people. So does it happen because you're
Hmm.
uncovering deeper layers
Hmm.
to keep that performance alive, to keep that
Hmm.
piece of art alive, or is it your self inquiry into something? I mean, I'm just trying to understand that why, right? Why does this happen also? I mean, and so many levels it's happening that
The kind of person I am, I would again say social context. Why does it happen in South America? Why does it not happen in England in quite the same way? Why do you have an artist like this in this context? In a sense, Boal is also intervening in severe conditions of poverty in his society, lack of education.
hmm,
And he finds theater a mode through which this kind of democratic intervention can happen for an audience, right? The similar reasons why Badur Sharkar in India would do the theater that he was doing. He found a theater. So in Bengal in the 1970s, Badur Sharkar creates a theater that is called the Third Theater today, which takes theater away from the proscenium and travels in the villages.
hmm,
Right, because his impulse for creating theater is to actually creating a collective space. And it means nothing if it were the proscenium, because only as the middle class could come and watch. He wants to perform for the rural poor,
hmm,
for the working classes. So he travels with his theater. And that means that his theater needs to take a certain form, a certain kind of shape. It needs to, so for example, in his play in the Michil, which is the world's classic play, Michil as in Julus, it's translated in Hindi as Julus, the
hmm,
procession. Um, Ultimately, the structure of the play is that in the end, the audience becomes part of the Michil and the actors fall away. So in every show, at the end of it, the actors have actually, they pick up one member of the audience after the other until 60, 70 people are walking around in that space, and the actors have moved away. So they
hmm,
have actually, metaphorically, the audience now has created the procession, which was started by the actors. And it's a long play, but it's
hmm,
about collective social transformation.
hmm,
So the thing that it happens here, but not in, let's say, an economically advanced, developed country, is because the need for it is here for this
hmm,
improvisation. And you
hmm,
will say that again, I'm pushing it to the external and reactions. Not necessarily. The thing is that one reacts as an artist to the world around, right? What it sees around. So the
correct.
fact is that poverty is also personal. It defines lives in a
Hmm,
certain way, what one is able to do or not do. An artist of a certain kind feels it imperative to respond to it, right? So then he improvises to
correct.
find the language. I'm giving an
Yeah,
example. There are many other reasons why artists might improvise.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, yes, this can.
yeah, go
I'm
on.
like
Yeah,
go on, and so to
yeah.
conclude, I've seen these cycles at a very superficial level, but maybe you
Mm,
can like give some more insights
mm,
that there has been waves or cyclical patterns, right? There was art for art's sake moment. Maybe before that, there was like didactic art or whatever. Like these cycles are there,
mm,
right?
mm.
Again, are these in these there are microcycles of improvisation, or like how do you look at this at a larger timeline, like is it
So I mean,
and obviously sorry, and
uh,
obviously like how do you look at the future also?
so I'm not a I'm not a historian of art, and I think the important thing with these kinds of historical conclusions is that they have to be very specific to context, to particular social and historical conditions, etc., etc., or particular art forms as well. But I do think you're right that there are microcycles, right?
Hmm, hmm,
It's not like one overarching change. Like the closer you go, it's like looking at something under a microscope, right? So from the outside, So I remember my grandmother was a doctor and a pathologist. When I was very young, she'd taken me to her laboratory and shown me, her microscope, and I saw these brilliantly colored moving objects. And I asked her, "What are these?" And he said, "These are germs." Then I looked out and I said, "Where are they?" He said, "You can't see them," but they were amazing inside that, under that lens. So the thing is, the closer you go, the more these kind of this absolutely vivid, colorful, complex structures become visible, right? But there are also kind of broader structures, even within these artists that I've mentioned, either Boal or Shorter, their lineages and their kind of what they have left behind, the people they have influenced, even those are very, very complex. So I spoke of poverty and social change. Boal is the most popular among corporates right now, because Boal's workshop games are extremely popular for corporate training across the world. So that's one strange irony, right? That these games have been picked up out of their context, and so it's complex. It has many, many different kinds of implications and changes, which the artist might not have even envisioned, but they happen, and one doesn't have control over it as well. Well, what I see for the future, this thing that I started with, I do feel that every moment of kind of restriction and unfreedom, after a point, has to generate its opposite at some point. And I think these things also are in a continuum, and one cannot have restrictive conditions socially and then have absolutely free art. It doesn't work that way. So things affect each other. And that doesn't mean that only society affects arts. Arts also affect society. It goes both ways, which is the point of hope. And the fact that it is in fact a dialectic or a dialogue between stability and change is what allows you to continue hoping for more improvisation and more,
Awesome.
Yeah,
I think this is a good note to end, because it gives a lot of hope, and also it kind of lays down a cyclical pattern, which is kind of again a hope. So cool. Thanks a lot, Trina, for giving your
Thank you
time.
so
It
much.
was wonderful talking to you. Obviously, I
Yeah.
have to comprehend this much better, made a lot of notes, and have to connect a lot of things to understand the context better. But
I hope
thanks
I
a lot.
didn't go into too many different directions, because my intention was not at all to be I was trying to keep it, as
Yeah. No, I
right.
mean, like, these names, it's worth investigating, because I'm not like in the world of design, you go deep dive, and the whole idea of Audiogyan was to just expand and understand other
I
genres.
wouldn't know the names you mentioned if you gave a design lecture on design. So yeah, that's fine. I guess we learn from each
Yeah,
other slowly.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
Okay, thanks a
Thanks
lot.
so much.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's it from today's Gyan session. For show notes and more Gyan, visit audiogyan.com. And if you wish to connect with me, I am at Audiogyan Moments on Instagram. Until then, take care.